I'd like to thank all of you for making it to this wonderful presentation that will be given. I'll ask Ms. Gallegos to actually do some formalities with our speaker, but just to kind of frame the context of today, one of the things that we're really thinking about outside of this concept of talent really is this idea of our pathways to college and career and moving forward. What I've discovered over the last couple years, as I've talked to students and many of you who have engaged in conversations with me around certain students, that there are some issues with the institutions that we send them to and their inability to actually support our kids at our high level. And I mean that with all due respect to what some of these institutions do. I'm talking about kind of Pima and the U of A, but there's a lot of gaps that, quite frankly, frame a narrative around our students that I think changes their trajectory in a negative way. And so one of the things that I've asked NJ and the team to do of counselors is to kind of rethink what our role is in that, both as advocating for our students with these other institutions, but also what are we doing internally to actually shift some of that narrative, more specifically kind of the poverty narrative and the understanding that some of our kids potentially don't have the ability to move on. And we know that that's not the case. And we know you do a lot of great work to get our kids teed up and set up, but if the systems aren't in place for them to know what to do after you've educated them at a high level, then we didn't do our job. And so the conversation today is really around kind of talking around some of these narratives, being much more intentional about what you do specifically and what we say, but also what are the systems that we have in place to support our students as they transition right out of our schools. And so you'll engage in a little bit more reflective conversations today or dialogue, but I think you're going to love our speaker as she kind of inspires us to think differently about this idea of post-secondary enrollment and education. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Gallegos, who will actually introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, buenos dias. Are you guys ready? Yes. Good. Hi. I like that. Well, I'm Ana Gallegos. I'm the Chief of Schools Officer, and I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Melissa Salazar. So let me tell you a little bit about her. After earning several degrees in science, a bachelor's in chemistry, chemical engineering from University of Berkeley, then an MS Food Science and Technology from UC Davis, Dr. Salazar realized that her true calling was in STEM instructional design and educational research. Dr. Salazar now has over 20 years of educational research. Dr. Salazar's experience in teaching and coaching STEM educators in both K-12 and higher education, and she has logged over 500 hours observing K-12 students and teachers in STEM classrooms. She has taught more than 15 different courses at R1, 4-year, and 2-year colleges in both California and New Mexico. She now lives in Española, New Mexico, and is much cooler there, I'm sure. And in 2013, founded Escala, a national professional development school for faculty who teach in Hispanic-serving institutions. She works full-time as Escala's Chief Executive Officer and is also a mom to a 6-year-old who wants to become a ninja. I thought that was cute. And as you know from what our superintendent talked to us about, our educators who were so wonderful doing the Ed Talk, our superintendent and educators talked about talents, those talents that our students possess, and she will help us make a connection to post-secondary work and how we can help our students be more successful. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Salazar. Thank you, and I think I move your PowerPoint.
Good morning, buenos dias. How are you doing? We had some little slide flippage here, but thank you so much. First of all, thank you for that lovely welcome, and thank you for your time today. I'm always so honored when I get to speak to high school teachers, which is who you are, right? Where I'm in the right room? Okay, awesome, I'm here. So high school teachers, you're doing what we like to say in New Mexico is the Lord's work. And then when I speak to community college professors, I say the same thing, because we are the ones that I think are closing the equity gaps in the US. I think we're the ones. So give yourselves a round of applause for being awesome. You are. Oh, come on, it's gotta be better than that. That was pretty weak. Let's do that again. Yeah. It's Friday morning at 8 a.m., right? You're like, please. Okay. So you saw my first slide. I'm gonna talk to you today about a lot of different things, but I thought before, when someone gets up and speak, you always like, well, who are they? And you make up stories about them. So I'll tell you some of the real stories about me so you don't have to make stuff up. But, and my employees always love it when I use memes because they're in their 20s and 30s and they think this is also awesome. So she threw this meme in there. But this is sort of a metaphor for my life, I think, up until now. And it always sounds like when someone does my bio that it all makes sense, right? Have you ever had that happen where you're trying to write about yourself and it's like, oh yeah, this path was totally clear and I knew exactly where I was going. And in fact, I took a really circuitous path to education, and for many years, I did not think I was an educator. I just kept saying that I was a STEM person. I kept getting STEM degrees, even though, frankly, I'm pretty terrible at mixing chemicals and I'm pretty terrible at doing stoichiometry. I still persisted that was my career path, until finally somebody late in my master's degree, this is like, after how many years of higher ed, said, it seems like you always are working in schools. Do you want to maybe think about a PhD in education? And I had never in 20 years taken a class in education in my life. So I said, well, what would that be like? So I took a graduate class in education. It was my very first class in education, and everybody was speaking a language I had no idea what they were talking about. I remember the first day I heard pedagogy, and I was like, whatagogy? What are you guys talking about? So I sat and listened for a long time in my education program before even speaking, and then realizing, oh, this is what I've been doing. This is what I want to do. But when I moved to New Mexico, which was just about 12 years ago now from San Francisco, I really came into another new left turn with education. Even though I had been teaching and I had taught college a little bit in San Francisco, I didn't really feel like I understood culture and education. And so a lot of people that hear me speak now are like, oh my gosh, it seems like that's something you studied, but I really, again, never took very many classes in it, didn't understand what the intersection was really about. But I moved to a really small area that was actually only tricultural. We have in Española, where I live, we have majority Hispanic or Latino, Latinx, and 15% of us are Native American, and then 15% are white. So this was, and that adds up to more than 100%, don't worry about my math. I told you that I'm not a STEM person anymore, okay? So I moved to this area, from this huge, the San Francisco Bay Area, if you've ever lived there, you just sort of are mingled side by side with so many different cultures, so many different languages. But then I moved to this area where everybody, every day, wanted to ask you the same question. Who are you? Who's your dad? Oh wait, do you know my tia? So in Walmart, you cannot get through Walmart in my town without talking about how your parents are doing, how your cousins, and then you run into somebody else so my husband hates it because he's like, you're like we go in for milk and you come out like, half an hour later with everyone's stories of who got divorced and all that kind of stuff. So this area really taught me a lot about what it means to be who you are and who your history is. Because in New Mexico, I don't know how many of you have been to Española. Has anyone ever driven through there? Woo! Yeah, 10,000 people. So if you blink, you miss it. But we're on the way to Taos, and we're just south of the Colorado border. And by the way, New Mexico is the state over from you guys. I forgot to lead up with that. Usually in California, I honestly have to tell them where it's at, because most people are like, is that near Arizona or Texas? I'm like, yeah, it's this big gap, right, in between, right? Anyway, so this has really been my, my real teaching of people telling me what it's like to live the cultural experience. And so I teach at Northern New Mexico College, which is the picture in the middle here. And this is an everyday experience where I walk into a classroom and I have to understand how students' cultures are impacting how they think about themselves, what they're gonna do in class, the ways that I need to communicate with them. And it's just been a revelation to me. And to be honest, getting really vulnerable here, right? Like this is How many, 200 of you? I might as well on Friday morning just tell you about all my mistakes. So one of the things that I think is really illustrative of this is that, I moved there from the Bay Area thinking, oh, I'm all diverse, I'm all multicultural, like I get this, and I walk in and the first day of class, in my stats class, there's 4 students that are absent. And they're absent the second class as well. And I was like, well, what is going on? These students obviously don't care, right? And as a college professor, the way you think about it is like, you just go there. You just go, well, they don't care. They didn't even email me. They haven't showed up. I'm going to drop them. You just start to have these narratives, right? And so I think I went to the faculty lounge, or I was talking to somebody at the college, and I said, why are these students absent? What is going on? And she goes, well, are they Native? And I was like, oh, well, I didn't even think to look at that. So I look at the roster, and I'm like, okay, yeah, it looks like they're Native, just make based on last name. And then she goes, oh, well, did you know it's feast day in San Ildefonso? So they don't come, on feast days, and this has been feast week, so if you had some students, you probably should have known. And I was like, well, how would I have known that? And I just felt so stupid that I had made all these assumptions, didn't know anything about what was going on in this new culture that I was living in. And again, my assumptions as an educator is like, I planned some awesome lessons. Why didn't they come? So instead of assuming, that maybe they had reasons to not be there that were very important to them, I made a lot of judgments, I made a lot of assumptions, and you kind of go down that path, and it really, it can really impact your expectations, of course, right, when they do come back to class. Like, wow, I would have appreciated a phone call. I could have been all sarcastic, but instead I was like, okay, let's just start at the beginning. So just a little, about how this impacts me. I don't know how well you can read this. Can you guys see this in the front area? Can you read it a little bit? I'm going to read the 2 things. We're going to do a little exercise so you can talk to your folks, because you're already going, I want to talk to them. I haven't seen them in a while. Okay, so let's do a little exercise about expectations and assumptions. So the question is, 2 Latinx, Latino high school graduates go to college. Who do you predict will finish? So here's, let's pretend you're like a counselor or somebody that knows these 2 things. So on the hat, it says on the left side, was the only Latina in her high school, was the only Latina in her high school, but she was also attended a high socioeconomic status high school, like in a high socioeconomic status area. And then on the right, this Latino attended a small rural high school with relatively poor outcomes for Latinos. Okay, so you're allowed to talk during this. I'm just going to keep going. So who do you think will finish just based on those 2 things? Go ahead and chat with the neighbor. Make really nice eye contact with them. Okay. So you may be thinking about the impact of poverty. And by the way, we don't know the poverty status of these students, but we know the poverty status of maybe their communities and other students that are going to their school. Now I'm going to give you some more. Speaks English only on the left, and on the right, Spanish is first language. And a little bit worried about his accent too. Okay, does this change your assumptions? Let's go to another one. So on the right side, this is really tiny. I'll read this. She will live in the dorm. Her family is 3,000 miles away from her college that she's chosen. And then on the right side, lives with his mother in an apartment near campus. How is this changing things to you? Here's their high school GPA. Ooh, does this change anything? High school GPA on the left is 3.8 and on the right is a 4.0. Okay, and 2 more. On the left, received a full merit-based scholarship to her college. On the right, has 2 jobs. Will work on campus and has an off-campus job as well. Okay, and I think there's one more. Okay, these are just for fun, or not, we'll see. has never received anything less than a B. And on the right, writes poetry for fun. Okay, have another quick conversation. Now that you have all this other information, how does this change or not?
Statistically, it's that last
Okay, let's wrap that last thought up in 10 seconds, and I'm going to hit my little chimes when I want you to come back.
that'd be good out of base.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even need it. Teachers are awesome. Here, we'll hit the chimes anyway, just because they're fun. That's my little signal to come back, because I will ask you a few more questions during the talk. So I know I can't see you, but I'm interested in you raising your arms. So how about you raise your hand if you think the girl on the left will be the one that will finish college. And don't worry, no one's videoing this part. Okay. How about on the right? I see a lot more hands on that one. How about both? Ooh, I know. You know, as high school teachers, we're always like, yep, they're all going to make it. Yes. That's why we're in this, right? We're in this for this hard work. Okay, I'm not going to tell you the answer. You have to wait till the end. Aww. All right, well, this is just a little exercise to think about. I'm sure we do this all the time. Remember I was telling you about these flash judgments that we make. You know, sometimes it's based on anecdotes and our histories with our students, maybe our own family experiences with college. But we make judgments is really all this is about. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just for us to recognize, you know, what do we use as our ways of deciding what we think will happen to our students. And I'm just showing this, I'm not expecting you to read this, but there's a lot of interesting things out there about culture, because culture is not your race and ethnicity necessarily, and it's also not something that's fixed. It's something that can change and be fluid as you go through your life. It can be based on a geographical area that you live in, your religion. So there's a lot of things that are visible. This is like a little iceberg, if you can visualize it as, you know, there's parts of culture that people can easily see, like your skin color. Like you make associations like, oh, this student has this skin color, they must be from this culture, or they are wearing something that designates that they're a certain religion. So, oh, okay, I think I understand. But underneath the surface, what I think is so fascinating about culture, as I've been studying it, is all the ways it changes how, or it shapes how you think about the world, how you think about each other, and how you communicate and even organize information. So it has a lot to do with what we're doing when we're teaching. But we don't think about those parts of culture. We're just thinking mostly about how we don't understand our own students, right? Because we're from a different culture, or we grew up in a different place, or we have different languages that we speak. So, you know, it's important, I think, to remember that patterns of decision making, the concept of justice, looking at some of the other ones down here, ordering of time. If someone comes from a culture where time is flexible and more fluid, and we have specific times where the bell, I don't know, do you guys have bells here? Yes. Yeah, woo, wait, yay for bells, right? So bells tell students what's going on, but you know, some students may come from a culture where, you know, time is like that's, I know that that's what you're telling me to do, but I'm taking my time to do this thing that also is very important to me. So, you know, that's the nice way of saying it, right? They're just late to class. But in college, this happens all the time, believe it or not, right? There's no bells in college, but we think as professors, oh yeah, let's like, you know, start class right at 8:01. So we plan all this great stuff, and then students coming in at 8:20, we can't help but be bugged. We can't help it. We're just like, what are you doing that was wasting my time? or wasting your time. But in reality, the way people think about time, they may not even trying to be offensive to you. So it's just interesting to think about how people are thinking about time versus us as instructors. So you've heard a little bit about my business. I just want to say a few things about that and define some language before we move on into the rest of this talk. So I run a business called Escala, and Escala is based in New Mexico. And now you have a map so you know where New Mexico is. And we're at the north part of the state that's extremely rural, but has a lot of small Hispanic serving institutions. And we work predominantly, what I've noticed is that we still have a predominantly white faculty, and that is true across the nation, and it's true in a lot of K-12 school districts as well. And so what I started to study was how those cultural differences really play out when you have a predominantly Latino and Native American population. So we've done lots of interviews. We do a lot of interviewing with professors, thinking about how they are thinking about their teaching and their relationships with students. And of course, we have faculty of color in our institutions as well, and it's always interesting to see how all these factors play out when we have the teaching and learning interaction. So a little thing about the words I'm using. So I do a lot of national work, and what I have noticed is that Latinx is becoming more and more utilized as the word to describe the population of students that we're serving in Hispanic serving institutions, and it's replacing Latino, Latina in a lot of contexts like academic writing because it's gender inclusive and non-binary. So just so you know, if you hear me say that, it's because that's the language that I'm starting to use. In the US Southwest, and especially in my county, it is not used, so sometimes I go back and forth between Latinx and Hispanic. And of course, in northern New Mexico, if you've ever been there, we call ourselves Hispanos, but nowhere else in the US do people understand the complexity of what that means. I also use another word, so there's a lot of language out there about underrepresented minority, what's another one? So underprepared can be another word. So there's always these under blank, right? So I use underserved because it shows that my feelings about this are that students aren't being served by the system, and it's not their fault that they're not being served. So I think underprepared sounds a little bit like, well, it could be students' fault that they're underprepared. They didn't prepare, right? So there's some implications there. So I like to use underserved, so you'll hear me use those too. So a couple questions that we've been investigating. What happens to Latinx and Hispanic students in this college pathway? How does culture matter? I've talked a little bit about that already. And then the last one I think is really fascinating. This is what I want you to talk about. What do we need to know about ourselves as instructors, either in a high school or in a college, in order to be more successful with our Latinx, Hispanic, and other underserved students that we're serving as well, right? So what do you think? Talk to another, you can turn around if you want this time. If you're sick of your shoulder partner, you can say bye and turn around. And just talk a little bit, I'll give you about a minute. What do you think you need to know about yourself? Let's say you were mentoring a brand new teacher to this district. What do you think they should know about themselves in order to be a successful teacher of the students here at Sunnyside? Okay, so I'll give you a minute to talk about that with someone near you.
Yeah, I was doing yesterday. Turning my back. Dude, they want me back next year. I just need to find some other gig for job. It's tough. You've been having one. I need to get her to go to war
Okay, 10 more seconds. I know you want to hear my chimes, right? Here they are. Does it remind you of Grease? Do you remember the movie Grease? You're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I would love to come down and talk to you, but I'm afraid of your stairs. So I'm going to kind of stay perched up here. But sometimes when faculty talk about this, they talk about, well, I need to know, you know, kind of, I feel like pressured that I need to know everything about the students' culture. Maybe I want to know what, you know, 18-year-olds are really caring about these days. So those are maybe some of the kinds of things you talked about. But we also at Escala have realized that what people really need to know about themselves are also what their educational background has taught them about way learning works. Just the kinds of things that you were taught, maybe they weren't like explicitly given to you as like, this is the way it works, but we kind of, when we go through an educational system, learn that that's the way learning works, right? And it's sometimes hard to really disrupt those narratives. So what we've learned is what I'm going to share with you today are 3 things that I thought was relevant to Sunnyside. You know, looking at your data and looking at the kinds of places that you're, kind of students that you're teaching here. One is what we've learned from working with all the colleges and high school students that we work with, how they really experience this transition. So we'll talk a little bit about that and, you know, the data. You probably know a lot about this already from the work that you've already done on your pathways, but I'll just give you some national data and then we'll compare it a little bit to Sunnyside. The second thing is I want to talk about these narratives. So we've already started down that road, like what does it mean about what I think? But I want to talk to you about what high school narratives, what high school students have narratives about in terms of their college going and how those intersect or don't or parallel and you know, what happens when they actually run up against each other. And then the last one, I want to leave us on a high note that there are instructors that feel they can disrupt these narratives by being very intentional about a few things that they do. But before we begin that, let's watch a video. It's time for a video. So let's see if I can get you guys to hear this properly. And it's just about 5 minutes, so you can sit back and relax. There's no popcorn offered, it's too early. But this is, let me tell you a little bit about the video before you watch it. We interview students as they finish high school and are anticipating going to college. So this is a compilation of a few of the students that we've been following for the last 4 years. So this is the video we took of the first year when they had just finished. So this was about 3 weeks after high school graduation in our area. They don't all go to the same school. We have many different high schools in our area. So we pulled some students out that had intended to go to college or have made a college selection. And we asked them, how did you find out about college? Like, who are the people that you've relied on to tell you about college? So here are their answers. Okay, let's have a conversation again at your row. What did you hear them say about how they've received advice or disappointments they might have had about how prepared they feel about what college is really going to be like?
It is, Coach.
Okay, another 10 seconds. We'll get my Zenergy chimes. Wow, I don't even need the chimes. All I need to do is hold this up and you guys get quiet. So when we do this at workshop, we do a lot more discussion about videos and how people are pulling out themes. But generally, when people see this video, they say things like, well, they see, like, especially Norman, the last young man that was on this video, talking about, like, you know, it's just sort of a pamphlet, you know, like, read at your own discretion is what he says, which is pretty interesting. So I think, you know, he feels a little bit like he wished he had known a little bit more before entering college and is feeling a little trepidatious. So we spent a couple hours with all these folks that year. This was 3 years ago now, but I remember one of the questions he asked me, he pulled me aside, you know, and we have kind of a counseling session when they're about to enter college, and I just say, you know, anything, just ask us anything you can think of. We're not your parents, we're not your teachers, you know, you're just here for just getting information, ask me anything. And he pulled me aside and he said, well, I don't understand the money. Like, how much money am I really gonna have to spend? Like, will I have enough to eat? Like, I really don't know that. And he was embarrassed that he didn't know. He knew he had financial aid. He knew he had a lottery scholarship, which is what we offer in New Mexico with a certain GPA. You get this thing called the lottery. But he said, I really don't understand how it's all gonna come down to, like, that I'm in this place, because he was moving away from home. And he just said, you know, I just really wish I knew more about how I'm going to, like, make it. Like, am I gonna have enough money to eat? And so that was, I thought, really interesting about him. You know, he's talking not just about college and classes and all that stuff, but just these basics. Am I gonna have enough money to go out to eat or buy shoes? I don't know. So for these high school students, where they were getting information about college really depended a little bit more on their families, right? Did you hear them say that over and over? My mom, my siblings, reading on my own. But they didn't appear to me, a lot of people say, well, they don't appear to be, you know, very confident. Maybe one of them, Ryan, the tall student in the second one, but not super confident, right? So let's talk a little bit about the data now that we have some student stories in our head about, because I don't like to show data without students in it, right? That's kind of weird for us as teachers to always look at data and not think about examples. So here's Arizona right here. This is a really neat map you can get from HACU, HACU, which is Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. People have focused a lot on the colleges that Latinxes are going to, but now, more recently, people are starting to look at the data on what's called an HSSD, which is, ta-da, Sunnyside. You're a Hispanic serving school district, and there are 402 in Arizona, and that's what this slide is telling you. And there's 135 in New Mexico, 680 in California. So this is a neat little map where you can see where the school districts are that are serving Latinxes. And by the way, serving as the federal designation just means that more than a quarter of your students are designated as Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, as how they self-report. So what's interesting about you guys and at the Southwest, like us in New Mexico, is that Latino students go to a relatively small percentage of colleges. So they don't quite spread around just to go to every single college in the state. They go to what's called an HSI. So here's a little fast facts about HSIs. There's a lot of them in the US. However, they are concentrated in California and the Southwest. But what's really interesting to me always when I think about this is what percentage of Latinos in the US that go to college actually attend an HSI. And look at this, it's 2/3. 2/3. So that means that we are concentrating ourselves in a relatively small number of school districts and a small number of HSIs. And here, just based on conversations with folks who have taught in Tucson and folks at Pima, is that Sunnyside is feeding primarily into a few colleges that are nearby, right? Maybe your students go away to college, but a lot of times students are attending schools that are nearby, and there's a 4-year and a 2-year and probably lots of other choices that I don't know about, but I picked these two just so you can see that both of these are Hispanic serving institutions, and here's their percent Hispanic enrollment. So Pima as a 2-year is 43% Hispanic, and U of A is 25. U of A, by the way, made a big splash when they became an HSI. It was like a big deal because they're so big and they're an R1, and they actively wanted to become a Hispanic serving institution. So nationally, that was a big deal when U of A announced that it had received HSI status. So you can see that they're just over the enrollment criteria right there, 25 point what. But look at where Sunnyside is, 88%. That's like northern New Mexico. So that's very interesting to me because I rarely come across a school district that has such a high percentage of Latinos attending. So some good news. The percent of high school completers who enroll in college immediately after graduation is on the rise for all groups, unfortunately, except for African Americans. If you look at this little, I don't know if you can see my mouse very well, but that's the only, this is the dotted line, that's the only line that is going down over time. It stayed relatively steady, went up, and then is going down is somewhere around 58%. So we are not doing well by our African American students nationally, but if you look at the lavender line I'm following right now, this is the Hispanic students who graduate high school that enroll immediately in college. So this equity gap has been reduced a lot, and I give a lot of credit to Hispanic serving school districts for moving this equity, moving like, what is it? It looks almost like 48% all the way up to 70%. So that's an amazing achievement over just 16 years. And this is for white students enrolling in college, and this is Asian students up here at the top. So we have some good news, at least for Latinos, and reducing the equity gap on how quickly they are enrolling in college right after graduation. But here's some bad news. There's always bad news, good news, right? So here's the bad news. A graduation gap persists, however, between ethnicity subgroups. There's a lot of different ways to parse out your data, but if you just look at it, this ethnicity, this is 6-year college graduation rates for both 2 and 4 years averaged together for 2010 to 2016, so this is recent, and this is about 2 million students are in this data set. So we still have, look at the gap between overall 56 and 46, we have a 10% gap in Hispanic student graduation rates. Okay, and we also always have to continually look at why are African Americans doing so poorly as well. And I would really like to see Native Americans on this chart as well, because that's another big population both you and I serve. Really bad news. If you look at just not graduating and you start to ask questions like, well, what happened? So it's hard to do graduation rates for 2 years because a lot of students transfer, right, and finish at another institution. So this is an interesting study where they actually asked, well, where did they go? So if you look at just this one right here, this is the overall on the left, but here's Hispanic right here. So over a third, 35% after 6 years of Latinx or Hispanic students are no longer enrolled at all. Like they're either stopped out, as they say, or dropped out. Stopped out means that you might go back within a certain period of time, but dropout is you're done. You have some college, but you're done. And in the red, it's about 20% are still enrolled after 6 years, meaning that they're still plugging along, they're either part-time, full-time, and then the blue and the orange are the completers. So that's about 45% of all students that start that are Latinx's finish within 6 years. Now you might want to argue, 6 years isn't so good, maybe we should extend it. I have many students who come to my courses that take 10 years to finish a bachelor's degree. But we just need to pay attention to is that these gaps don't just happen, right? They're not just, you know, they're there, don't worry about them. People really need to investigate these because we need to unpack what are the structural issues or what are some other things that we can do to easily make these gaps go away, really, right? These opportunity gaps. So one of the ones that I think is interesting for you to note because of the work you're going to do today and the pathways that your unified school district is starting to do is that Latinxes are twice as likely to choose a 2-year over a 4-year. Twice as likely. And that is nationally and within Arizona, because I didn't want you to think that I was just going to give you national data, but this is in Arizona as well. So between 2004, which is at the top here, and 2014, and in fact that gap has pretty much stayed at the 20% difference, or twice as likely, no matter whether you look at 2004 or 2014. Twice as likely to choose a 2-year. You might have some ideas about why that's so, which are things that you can unpack with your students is why they're more likely to do that if that's true here. But the problem with that, because there really is no problem, Pima is awesome. I've been to Pima, I've talked to a lot of the folks at Pima, I know they're doing good work. But nationally, if we want students to graduate, what the data shows us is that a Latino student who attends a public 4-year is more likely to finish than their peers who attend public 2 years. And they finish faster. Now that might seem like a no-duh thing, but people hadn't really tracked this until recently. This is another thing that's probably a little bit hard for you to read, but I have shared this with your administrators that could also send you the link to this, where you can look at this more intensely, that if 100 Latino college students, of them, 51 go to a 2-year, 36 go to a 4-year, and then it actually tracks them over time. And it also looks at something called enrollment intensity, that it actually matters whether they're part-time, full-time, or something called mixed enrollment. Mixed enrollment meaning they're both. I know lots of students, and you probably know some as well, that go back and forth between part-time, full-time, part-time, full-time. So that's called mixed enrollment. And all of these things make a difference. Whether or not they're at a 2-year or 4-year, and whether or not they do mixed enrollment, makes a big difference on their outcomes. But look at this completion here. This is again of 6-year completion. Look at how low these numbers are out of 100 students. So this is the percent of that. Let's just say that that's 100. This is the number, so it would be like 4 students, 1 student, 12 students, 11. So these numbers have to go up if we want to be saying that we're successful at doing our work of either preparing students for college, helping them choose an appropriate pathway for themselves, and making smart choices with their money, right? This is no joke to not finish college, and you've heard about that in the national news, that loan forgiveness is a huge thing right now because students are graduating with loans or not with loans, and it makes a big difference to them. So just to wrap up some of this data stuff before getting to our narratives, we just need to pause and think about all of the ways that that decision to go to a 2-year or a 4-year is not just this, like, comes out of nowhere. Again, right? Gaps don't just happen. So Latinx college students are more likely to have attended a concentrated poverty high school that has a high administrative turnover and inexperienced teachers, and this is not to insult any school district or particular, there are just systemic educational disparities in the US that we have to pay attention to. Okay, they're also more likely to attend an open enrollment college, which has a lower graduation rate. So if they're picking if they're twice as likely to pick a 2-year public institution that has a low graduation rate, well, that explains some of these gaps, right? And last but not least, we cannot forget that a high proportion of them are first-generation college going, work full-time, and are low income, so they're providing for their families because they have to. You know, this is not something that I just having a job because I feel like I need a job. The segregation by poverty, I just want to pause for a minute because this is like, it's almost, I don't want to say it's more important than race and ethnicity, but the correlations of poverty in the United States with educational outcomes is screaming out for attention, and I don't think it can be ignored. And that one of the things that's happening with Hispanic Latinx students nationally is that they're concentrated into schools, both K-12 and college, where a lot of the other students are also from low-income areas, neighborhoods, and high schools. So this, they're calling this in Stanford University, this is the new segregation. This is the new segregation, is that we're now having everyone who comes from a high poverty community and background go to school together. And that this gap between the richest and the poorest students does not start in college or in their college choices. It starts by the time we start measuring, which is grade 3, right? We kind of like let everybody scoop by, and then in grade 3 we hit them up all these tests. So here we are, Hispanics in poverty. Look at how high that is. So I think when we talk about Latinxes and Hispanics, and I don't need to tell you this, I'm just saying, you know, this data, we always have to consider how poverty is affecting our students by the time they reach high school, and look at how they're compared on state standardized tests. So this is again from the Stanford poverty studies that are being done, is that you can test 4 grade levels apart between the highest socioeconomic status students and the lowest. And it doesn't matter exactly what your family's background is, but if you attend a school that has predominantly low-income students, you perform about as well as that school does. So what does that do to your narrative? And I think your superintendent was talking about that in the introduction. What does that do to their narrative when they know no one else in their high school is doing very well? So, you know, there's a lot of research out there about failing high schools. I don't want to go into that because it's not my field of research, but look at the college completion gap by income. 54% college completion rate from the highest quartile or income quartile of students, and versus 9%. So when you take race and ethnicity out of the equation for a second and just look at income level of these students, this gets even more graphic, right? Very interesting. Okay, so turn to a partner. I've been talking for a while and have a conversation about income disparities and anything that's relevant to you here at Sunnyside. Okay, 10 seconds. Whew. Looking at data is always feels really depressing and something that we need to do, but that we can't forget there are real people involved, right? But I know that income disparities is probably an issue in your community just like it is in mine. I live in one of the poorest counties in the US, so income is probably one of the biggest factors that plays a role in whether my students finish or not. So I don't like to give them misinformation about courses or their pathways, because I feel like gone are the days, if we ever did have them, where a student could explore something and take some extra units. Because that is really not how people are thinking about college any longer. So that mythology about college is gone, that it's really a time for exploration. It's kind of sad, right, if we went through that period, but I'm not sure that was really ever true for us. But that is not the way students approach school, and I think it's a disservice to them to say, you know, well, just kind of see how it goes. You know, I think students are now thinking, oh my gosh, I really need to get a job. I already have a job. I need food on the table, and like Norman, I need to know, how, am I going to be able to survive this for 4 to 6 years of not having enough money? So we're going to finish up. I have about 15 minutes left, and I'd really like to have us finish up by all of that being background, but talking about what this means for us, because our work is really in the relationship, right? You guys, I'm sure, have great relationships with your students, and that's what you see is almost as important as the content you teach, or maybe even more. So how are narratives of failure part of this equation? And I'm not here to accuse anybody of having these, but it's just a pattern that I've noticed has developed at times between Latinx students and themselves, and then faculty, high school or beyond, talking about the same narratives and having them almost exist to drive each other. So I want to show you what I mean by that. But first I do want to talk, this is something I mentioned in the beginning, that there is a cultural divide that exists. It may not be as strong at Sunnyside. You may feel like you have quite a diversity in your teaching pool, But nationally, I just want to show you a map here. The darker red the color, the bigger the gap between non-white teachers and non-white students. So in California, it's particularly prevalent that you can have a 50% gap between the number of non-white faculty you have and the students. And it's also pretty dark over here too as well in Southwest, meaning that there's a 31 to 40% difference. So I think we really have to say that that's the elephant in the room. If we're not talking about it, then we don't really know how to move forward, right? So and I'm not saying at all that white teachers can't teach students of color, but I think it just means that we all need to be really intentional about who we are and what we're doing and what our narratives are about both ourselves, how learning works, and again, what our students are doing. And I just want to point out, this is sort of just a refresher that, you know, culture just isn't about food and all that kind of stuff. I know you guys know this, but just remind yourselves that it's also about the way you cognitively organize information, how you attribute success or failure to yourself or to others, how you like to compete or not. So all of these are cultural ways of knowing, and they play a role in the way we organize our classrooms and the way we motivate our students. So I think that when people get to that first year of college, they've already internalized, this is the narrative of the student, right? So I'm going to start with them. They've already internalized some low academic expectations for either having a lot of students around them that didn't do well or attending schools that have those high failure rates. There's a little bit of stuff going on with students, maybe not even a little, but there's an adequate amount of narrative that's coming from a suspicion that they don't belong when they get to college. And it may happen earlier, but it's really, really important at that first college class of looking around and seeing if other students, first of all, look like them, might even be from the same community or I know them, and the teacher. And who is this person? Do they know me? Do they see me? Is a very important thing, because if they feel that they don't belong, it can really lower their motivation to continue. You know, college is really about persistence, right? It's about the long game, not the sprint. So starting to feel like I don't belong here, I'm not sure that this is really for me. Oh, I knew I didn't belong, I got a bad grade. It's about that resilience, about keeping going. And then the last one is not understanding how to adapt to something I call low context learning. That means that you're popped into a college classroom where things aren't all been made relevant for you. You may not know why you're taking this English 111 class. You may not know why you have to learn a 5-paragraph essay. It's no longer being made into something that's useful or relevant. You have to figure out for yourself how it's useful or relevant. So students' failure to adapt to that, I think, can be a real source of disengagement. So I'm going to look at this as like little balls in a bucket or something like that, like a funnel. So first we'll take a look at instructors. This is the mutual disaffect that I'll talk about because I'll pop up the student on the right, but just consider instructors. And I'm, again, not saying that this is you, but think about maybe people this reminds you of or flashes of times when you've had this happen to you. So I'm going to read them because you probably can't see all of them all the way in the back. So one of the first balls says, not all students have the capacity to learn the content I'm teaching. So that can be a negative narrative that we have. Another one on the right can be, students don't care about learning this stuff. And when does that happen? That happens when they get out their phones, when they come late, or when they don't come to see you to make up work, right? There's all these things that students have, patterns of behavior, and you just start to think, oh, students don't care. And then the last one at the bottom says, helping struggling students takes away from everyone else. And I have to say that this is one that when I was early on teaching college, I was like, I'm just going to focus on the students that really want to learn from me, right? The easy guys, we love them, right? Like, oh, they're coming to my office hours, they're talking in class. So we have this tendency to turn towards them and away from struggling students because we're like, well, I just don't really have time. You know, I mean, these students want to learn and they don't. So, you know, there we go. And this is all just to be vulnerable and honest with ourselves. We are human beings, and that when people aren't doing well, these kinds of, I don't know what to call them, maybe just like balls in this funnel, start to churn out a feeling of being burned out. of being disengaged ourselves, right? And this can happen. It doesn't happen all the time maybe, but maybe you just have a bad year and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. All right, now we're gonna pop up the student. So similarly, did that come up? There it goes. Okay, so students say, I'm not sure. So watch how these narratives are parallel. So the faculty one was, not all students have the capacity to learn this. The student one says, on the other hand, I'm not sure I have the capacity to learn this, right? Remember like sort of the niggling doubt that they might have about their own ability. Students don't care about learning, the instructor thinks, and guess what the student thinks? I don't know if the instructor cares that I learn either. So do you see how these are parallel? They're actually like going in circles at the same rate. And the last one, helping struggling students takes away from everyone else. Well, guess what a lot of students believe when we interview them? I'm not sure I'm even able to ask for help. I'm not sure, and really the implicit thing they're saying is, I'm not sure I really deserve it. Like maybe I'll ask them outside of class, but I would never take up class time to ask a professor or my teacher for help. So these narratives we have seen over and over and over in our work with instructors and students, and I'm not saying it has anything to do with race and ethnicity differences, but I think it does have something to do with the fact that these narratives are so similar that they almost seem to feed off each other. The student coming in saying, I'm not sure if you care about my learning, and the instructor saying, well, I'm not sure you care to learn, can be a way that people turn away from each other. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we've seen this play out. So we do lots and lots of professional development, and again, this is not to insult anyone, but it's to just be honest that there's people that said they've said these things to students and ask, well, why isn't this motivating? So read some of these and say, does this motivate you to go to them for help? And some of these are very subtle. They look like they're reaching out to students, but in fact, the student might see them as like, you don't care about me. Since you did so poorly, you need to come see me. If you don't do well on the next assignment, so the next one's a threat, right? Like a thinly veiled threat. If you don't do well on the next assignment, you'll probably fail. I know lots and lots of college instructors that use that as a motivator. Has anyone ever had anyone say that to them? Where have you been? You've missed a lot of work. And this could start off as like genuine concern about absence. Where have you been? You've missed a lot of work. Don't just come back and expect me to help you though, so you're kind of like annoyed. You want to show them you're a little annoyed. I'm sure you had something much more important to do than to come to class. So this is like one of our favorite sarcasm, right? And then in New Mexico, when people move to New Mexico, which a lot of folks do because they fall in love with the geography and the culture, but they notice that students are absent a lot because of things like funerals or doctor's appointments by family. So you sure have a lot of those to go to, almost like a suspicion, right? And they don't realize it's actually true that students feel pulled to do things with their family that may mean that they miss class. You just need to try harder and study more. So the question we ask them is, would you go to help if somebody said this to you? Maybe they would. Maybe they have found this motivating in their own education, and that's why these are persisting out there in these instructors' lexicon. But we find that failure, scolding, and blaming are really not very good motivators for minoritized students because they already don't trust this process. They already have some of this narrative going for them. I would not say all, but I would say a huge pattern that we have seen for minoritized students, Latinx students, is that not wanting to go ask for help is something that they feel, right? They don't know if they deserve the help or that they even know what they need to ask you. So failure, scolding, and blaming really push them even further away because they're thinking, well, I kind of knew either I didn't belong here or this wasn't for me. And that causes them to underselect where they go and probably be pretty insecure when they're there. So all of those probably mean that we need to have an active way of breaking this cycle of disconnect. So I'm going to finish up by, let's see, I have a couple minutes left. I think what I'm going to do is just end you with some thoughts, because I know you're about to go do a day of work with each other. So I'm going to end you with some thoughts about how you can do this, even though you are not the college instructor, but how you can prepare them, because I heard that said a couple times already this morning. And what I want to tell you is that the research shows us that what a person says about a student's academic potential is the kind of relationship that matters. So we say this a lot to college faculty because they think that we're asking them to go like give hugs to all their students and all that kind of stuff. We're saying, no, it's not that. What you're trying to do is develop a relationship that shows you think they are intellectually capable and that you're supportive of their continued academic achievement. And that might mean for all of you that when you're thinking about helping students into pathways, you ask more questions and assumptions. Like, can I maybe push them a little bit beyond what they're comfortable doing so that they're not under-selecting what they're doing, right? And are we giving them an appropriate set of questions? And are we telling them we believe in them? Because they may need that from us. So this also requires us to really be intentional about culture shift. So I'm just going to show you some past things that I think have been also creating these gaps. One is the assumption that students are most responsible for the fact that they've been prior underprepared or underserved, and that our job is to sort out students that aren't ready or able to succeed. And like I said before, interact mostly with students that the ones are already ready to succeed or capable of succeeding. So those are really, I think, they don't help us with our equity work. They're there, we slip into these modes because this is really how traditional education has worked, is the past. I think the future, if we're going to be equity focused, and I'm sure you're already doing a lot of these things, but really to be intentional about shifting our narratives to really understanding how our underserved students' educational traumas have affected their behavior and their selection of where they go next with themselves. And the other one is taking ownership, our own ownership of whether students are learning or not, instead of trying to sort them. And then the last one is, this is our favorite part, right? Because this is where we can be the teachers, teach underserved students how to become master learners, and assume that the brain is plastic, right? That even if they haven't learned very well so far, does that mean that it's a done deal? When does it become a done deal? Right? When do we say, you know what, I just don't think you're going to do very well, I'm not really sure. We have these narratives that we have to just examine and go, how do I know? How do I know how well they'll do? So I did a little experiment, and I'll finish my talk off with this, that I did a little experiment on myself, right? Because I told you before I really like to share my failings with a lot of people in a room like this, so here we go, here's another one. I was not assuming that all my students could learn. I went into a lot of my college instruction after being an instructional coach for a long time in K-12. When I started teaching college, I was like, I bet there are probably like 3 to 5% of my students that probably just won't pass, that are probably like, their lives are too chaotic for them to succeed in college. So I didn't actively know I was doing that. But I decided to do a little strategy on myself. And I said, I'm going to tell myself every week that all my students are going to pass this class. And not only that, I'm going to set the bar pretty high. They're all going to get a B, so I was teaching mathematics. So I said this every week to my class for 16 weeks, which isn't very long, right? You guys have twice as long as that, some of you. So I want all of you, not just some of you, to get a B or higher, and I'm going to work hard to make that happen. And this is what happened when I asked students at the end of that class, what did you think about me saying this every week? And I didn't say it like a robot, I was kind of, saying it, but I made sure that every week I had this little index card in front of me, and I made sure I said it every week in some way or another. So this is what one of my students said. I thought you were full of until you said it every single week. Then I wanted to make it true. So they felt sorry for me, right? And then another student said, once I realized you were serious, I felt like I couldn't let you down, and I wanted to work harder. So this was pretty indicative of how students felt about that. And for the first time ever, I only had one student who didn't pass my class, and it was because she didn't show up for the final for various reasons that I don't feel like going into here, but I had every student pass my class almost. And that was, I felt like it changed me and it changed my students. So that's the kind of active, breaking these narratives that I want to end you with, is what can you do? You know, and I'm being honest here because I don't think any of us are perfect and we all have work to do. And that's why I want to share with you that even though I'm up here, this doesn't mean that I think my work is done. But just these little changes, what do you think will happen to our students? So I know my time's up, but I promised you the answer, right, to these questions about who these two students are. Well, it's me and my dad. So here's my dad. Do you remember the young man? And we talked about what a lot of people think are barriers, right? So he had a very strong non-cognitive preparation and he was mentored. He was mentored in his small rural high school that actually had very bad outcomes for most of his friends, but he also had the ganas. He had this desire to finish, which I bet a lot of you talked about when you talked about those silhouettes. He ended up getting a double major in 4 years, went on to get a PhD, and never got anything less than like I don't know, he said his graduate GPA was like almost perfect. So there's my dad, right? Those barriers that he overcame, they weren't barriers, right? And then if you look at the young lady, which was me, what happened, right? She's all set up for success. She has the money to go to school and she has no language barriers, but she also didn't have any resilience. So I had no resilience to overcome some of the things that happened early on in college. And I also lacked what I thought was very important to me at the time, was that I didn't know I needed to have a supportive peer relationship and networks in the STEM program. So I didn't have anybody cheering me on in my classes or helping me out, and I was very much alone. So my college outcome was that I stopped out and took a year off after basically being told to leave very nicely by the counselors at UC Berkeley, and then finish later. But my final college GPA, look at it. I didn't feel like I could do anything. So that's one of the reasons that I feel like this is my heart work, is to come back and look at students like myself that maybe people think are just going to be fine, and really look at how complex it is. So I'll leave you also with this last slide. This will be available to you, I think, later, but that there's lots of kinds of wealth our students have, which can also help us break our narratives. And they can be that they have extreme refusal to quit and perseverance because of all the barriers they've had to overcome already. And this is the work of Dr. Lara Rondon. She's in Texas and is retired now, but has written a lot of work about Latinx assets. Navigational wealth, the fact that they've had to overcome some of these, what we would call barriers, means that they can also navigate multiple worlds and tolerate ambiguity once they get to college. There's the familial wealth. Think about some of those videos you heard students talking about, drawing upon their families' understandings and histories. Aspirational wealth, that they have strong desires to succeed and actually have some pretty strong career goals. Do you know students that have strong career goals? I bet you do. That's their aspirational wealth coming up, where they actually have latched onto something and they really think that this might be their pathway. So what you're there to do is provide key advice and examples to make sure that that aligns with what they think it is. And then last but not least, people don't like to talk about this in K-12 public education, but I think we can't get away from the fact that our students, many Latinx students, have a pattern of spiritual wealth. And we hear that all the time in college. The students are drawing upon their faith to keep going when things get rough. And I think, that no matter what the rules are about the way we talk about this, just know that that's there for them. And I think that's an important way that we can just be mindful in how we serve our students. So thank you so much for your attention. I apologize for going a few minutes over my time. I know you guys have a break coming up. And I wish you luck on your work today. And thank you again for your attention.